Thank you for watching the Professor's Podcast. Today we're going to continue our discussion on a biblical response to transgenderism or to the transgender movement. In the first video, which if you have not seen, I will link to in the description of this video, we talked about a basic foundation for the Bible's teaching on sex and gender. We learned, for example, first of all, that sex is binary, that God had created male and female, as Genesis chapter 1 says, so God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him, male and female created he them. So therefore, there are two sexes, two genders that God created. Because sex is binary, there are also certain distinctions that are biologically inherent to male and female. That is, men and women are different. That should not be controversial. However, in this day and age, and especially within the transgender movement, it is. There are certain biological realities that make us distinct, but there are also ways that men and women behave that make them distinct. This is not to support stereotypes or to promote stereotypes. It is just a general observation of the way things are. And I believe that we should all be honest about that. But third, just because men and women are different does not mean that they are not equal. In fact, they are equal. And the Bible makes that very clear. Men and women are equal in their relation to God. Men and women are equal in their relation to one another. Men are responsible to God for how they treat people. Women are responsible to God for how they treat people. And we are accountable to God for how we treat one another. And men and women are both equal in relation to salvation. Neither gender, male or female, has an advantage when it comes to accepting Jesus Christ as their Savior, having their sins forgiven, and having a relationship with God. So we are equal in that respect, and we are equal within the creation. And then finally, we also learned that not only were men and women equal, not only were they distinct, not only is there a binary system of sex and gender in God's creation, but that also men and women both share a singular purpose. And that is to reflect God's character for God's glory. You cannot reflect God's character without being aligned with His Word, that's the Scriptures. And you cannot glorify God unless you are ready and prepared, willing to embrace what God made you to be. And God made you what you are, and that is how you are to glorify Him. Now, in this episode, I would like to talk about terms and claims of the transgender movement. Terms and claims. You know, there's a lot of terminology that's thrown out there in relation to transgenderism that sometimes can be quite confusing to people. There are terms that the transgenders use that have a meaning that you and I may not necessarily use. And so I think it's important to kind of explore a little bit of the terminology and then to see how that terminology rolls into the claims that the transgender movement is trying to make. So I have a couple of terms here that I'd like to go over. First of all, the term sex. Now, the way that this is understood is that sex is the biological makeup or composition of a person. That is, a person is classified as male or female given how their bodies are organized for sexual reproduction. I believe that that's a very important aspect. In fact, that quote is going to basically be drawing from a book by Ryan Anderson called When Harry Became Sally, and that is about the transgender movement. What I think that is important to understand about this term sex, it's probably a term that you and I are very familiar with, and we would use it based on that definition. That is, sex is based upon how the human body is arranged or organized for human reproduction. However, the transgender movement, and by the way, let me just say this. I do not believe that every person who identifies as transgender is an activist or is involved in pushing forward this particular movement. I believe that there are actors who are activists and who are trying to advance an agenda who basically would push this kind of narrative, but they would prefer the term sex assigned at birth. And that's because they would say that the doctors said that this was true about you, but that doesn't mean that it is the reality. So they want to say that basically sex is something that may be somewhat superficial, that people would say about you. However, that may not necessarily be the reality. So it's important for us to understand that term as it is sometimes used. Another term that is used, of course, is the word gender. Sex, of course, as we use it and as is commonly understood, refers to the biological organization of a human body for human reproduction. Gender, however, is defined this way from the American Psychological Association, quoted in a book by Andrew Walker, stating attitudes, feelings, and behaviors that a given culture associates with a person's biological sex. Now, by this definition, gender is something that you express, but it is based on biological sex. As we noted in our previous video, there are certain behaviors and attitudes, I would say senses of expression, that differ between men and women. This is not to say that there isn't variety within male and how male expression works, that there's not variety within the female sex and how female expression works. There's a variety in all of those things, which is where sometimes we get the term, specifically speaking on the female side, the tomboy. That is a young lady. She is female. She is biological sex female, but yet she does things that we would typically classify as being boyish. That does not make her a boy. That is just an expression of the variety that can be true within that particular sex. So this definition of gender, though, has a lot to do with expression and behavior, but I want you to note that it is based on biological sex. So the term gender. Now, specifically within the transgender movement is the term gender identity. Gender identity, as defined again in a book by Andrew Walker called God and the Transgender Debate, states here that a person's self-perception of whether they are male or female, masculine or feminine. In the American Psychological Association, a definition of this gender identity is a person's internal sense of being male, female, or something else. And this is added in the definition in the American Psychological Association dictionary. Anderson, in his book, When Harry Became Sally, also says that it may be called an inner sense of self. In other words, how do you feel yourself to be? So gender identity has more to do with feelings than anything else. So biological sex, there is a very clear scientific and I would say medical way to determine what sex you are, male or female. Gender, that has to do with expression, attitudes, behaviors, feelings, so on and so forth, that a culture tends to associate with a person's biological sex. That is, there are certain behaviors that we just tend to classify as female and male. Again, not denying the fact that there can be variety within them. But then we get into a term called gender identity. This is much more subjective. This is much more internal, how a person feels. And contrary to statements and claims that are made by the transgender movement, there is no scientific basis at all for distinguishing between a person's biological sex and gender identity. We will link in the description below a study about a court case that's come out recently that makes that absolutely clear. So you can check that out if you're interested. Then, another important term within the context and discussion of the transgender movement is a term called gender dysphoria. Gender dysphoria is a legitimate, I would say, psychological condition that people can have. And again, let me just say this, as defined at times by the American Psychological Association, quoted here in Andrew Walker's book, the distress associated with thinking there is a mismatch between the gender that matches a person's biological sex and the gender that they feel themselves to be. Now, let me just say that this is a genuine sense of distress. I would say that people who are experiencing gender dysphoria really are rather confused. And so I think that it is an unpleasant experience, no doubt. And so we certainly do not want to make light of that at all. This video is not intending in any way to cast judgment. It's simply just to explain terminology so that Christians, you can understand this terminology as it's being used among the transgender activists and within the transgender movement. So that is gender dysphoria. Now, let me point this out as well. Gender dysphoria is a dysphoria, and it is classified as a dysphoria, much like another condition that we may not think of in this very technical term dysphoria, but that is anorexia. Anorexia is also classified as a dysphoria. And so much like anorexia, where someone's perception of their weight does not match reality, individuals with gender dysphoria experience real feelings of distress about their gender identity. So the sense that they feel is real. But again, let's go back to biological sex, gender identity, which really has to do with the way a person feels, and gender dysphoria, which again has to do with a person's feelings and their perception of reality. Is it possible to perceive of something and to perceive that it is real, although it is not real? It is very possible indeed. But gender dysphoria is a legitimate and, I would say again, an unpleasant experience for those who believe that for whatever reason, there's a mismatch between what they are biologically and what they quote unquote truly are as far as their gender is concerned. Then the final term that I'd want to look at here is transgender. Transgender is an umbrella term that is a term for the state or condition of identifying or expressing a gender identity that does not match a person's genetic or biological sex. So it's kind of this umbrella term that applies in a lot of different ways. So for example, someone who perhaps is a man but who chooses to dress as a woman would dress, that is in skirts, in dresses, maybe wears makeups, well, that may be someone who is classified as a transgender person. It could also go as far as someone who has had cosmetic surgeries or reconstructive surgeries to basically change their physical anatomy to match with the sex that they believe themselves to be. That also is transgender. But there, if I could point out, is a very vast difference between someone who dresses in the clothing, in the attire, or with the makeup, and with all of the different clothing and attire that we associate with one gender or another, and someone who is basically going through a medical procedure to make these physical anatomical changes. Yet the term transgender is an umbrella term that really applies to all of those. And I believe that we should be very, very careful and conscious of that fact, but careful in how we talk about things when we relate to transgenderism. Again, many, many people who are dealing with gender dysphoria that have this unsettledness about what they are and is there a mismatch or not, we should be very careful about that. It's a very real experience. It's an unpleasant one. And we as Christians should be concerned about pointing people back to reality and back to the truth and not dwelling upon these internal feelings. So cross-dressing, cross-sex hormones, so on and so forth, undergoing surgeries, all of those things kind of fall under this umbrella term of. So our 5 terms, at least that we've looked at right now, are sex, gender, gender identity, gender dysphoria, and transgenderism. Now, what are the claims of the transgender movement or the transgender ideology? Because to suggest that a man can be trapped in a woman's body or vice versa is being supported by certain claims among transgender activists. And again, please note, just because someone is transgender or suffers gender dysphoria does not make them an activist. And I believe that there are probably many people out there who struggle with gender dysphoria, who are kind of on the edge about whether or not they should begin cross-dressing or whatever it is. I would not consider them activists, and I believe that probably most people are not into the activism of transgenderism, yet they are out there, and so therefore the issue is here, and it is in our faces, and it must be addressed. So how can these claims that a man is trapped in a woman's body, what are the claims that basically underlie this transgender worldview? What are the claims that they're making? And here's where we'll see a little bit of this terminology that we've just learned come in. The first claim that I think is important to note is that biological sex and gender identity can be opposite. So the first claim is that a person can be biologically, anatomically, chemically, molecular level one biological sex, and yet their identity, that is male or female, can be something completely different than what they are biologically. Biological sex and gender can be opposite. So in other words, you can have this anatomy of one sex, but in some sense recognize yourself as being the opposite of that. For example, gender has always been expressed in different ways in different cultures. What has changed today is that many see gender as unattached to sex, coming from Andrew Walker's book, God and the Transgender Debate. Again, Ryan Anderson in his book, When Harry Became Sally. According to the Trans Students Educational Resources, that is created for transgender students or students who suffer with gender dysphoria who are toying with transgenderism, biological sex is an ambiguous word that has no scale and no meaning besides that it is related to some sex characteristics. We prefer, this was their term, sex assigned at birth. So listen to what the Trans Student Educational Resource says. It says, biological sex is an ambiguous word that has no scale, no way to measure, and no meaning besides that it is related to some sex characteristics. This is a straight up claim from transgenderism. One transgender slogan quoted in Vaughn Roberts' book on the transgender movement is that anatomy is not destiny. So biological sex and gender identity can be opposite is a claim that is made by the transgender movement, and they go so far as to say that biological sex cannot be measured. There's no scale to it. It is only related to some sex characteristics, again, which would have to be male, female, anatomical body parts that basically show, oh, okay, you're a male or you're a female, but that's as far as it goes. And that's very different than your gender identity, according to the transgender claim. But the claim goes further than just saying that you sense yourself to be a different gender. Here's the second claim, is that whatever gender a person feels they are or claims that they are is what they are. So regardless of your biological sex, male or female, if you feel yourself to be the opposite of that, then what you feel is real. That's the reality of the matter. Quoting from the Human Rights Campaign, contrasting transgender people with real people or biological men and women is a false comparison. They, that is transgendered people, are real men and women. And what they mean by that statement is that if you are a man and you are living as a woman, and if you've had surgeries basically to reconstruct your anatomy to be female-like, then you actually are a woman. Not that you are a male who thinks he's a woman, not that you are a male who is pretending to be a woman. No, you're a male, you feel yourself to be a woman, then you are a woman. That takes that idea of biological sex and gender identity being different and takes it so much further. So that is what you are. Deanna Atkins, who was at one point, and maybe still is, the professor at Duke University School of Medicine, is quoted as saying this: "It is counter to medical science to use chromosomes, hormones, internal reproductive organs, external genitalia, or secondary sex characteristics to override gender identity for purposes of classifying someone as male or female." Friends, this was the Duke University School of Medicine professor saying that to use chromosomes, hormones, anatomy is counter to medical science to classify a person as male or female. Again, as I said, we will drop this in the comment section below about a study that debunks the idea that there is any scientific evidence to a person's gender idea being legitimately distinct from a person's biological sex or anatomy. But this is the claim that's made by the transgender movement. Anderson, that is Ryan Anderson, in his book When Harry Became Sally, comments this: at the core of the ideology of transgenderism is the radical claim that feelings determine reality. Feelings determine reality. What you feel you are is what you are. Claim number 3. Following or expressing this inner sense of self is the path to fulfillment. The only way that you as a person, if you experience this disconnect, this mismatch between what you are biologically and what you feel yourself to be internally, the only way to be fulfilled is to follow the path that's blazed for you by this inner sense of self. That is, follow it, express it. That's the only way that you can have the path to fulfillment, is to follow through with that. Again, quoting from Dr. Deanna Adkins, the appropriate treatment for individuals who are transgender must focus on alleviating distress. I could not agree more. How do you do that, Dr. Adkins? Through supporting outward expressions of the person's gender identity and bringing the body into alignment with that identity. The only path to fulfillment, according to Dr. Adkins, is to change the physical body to match what a person feels that they are. We will note in a subsequent or following video, we will note how impossible it is to alter a person's physiology, chemistry, anatomy to match with this idea that you are now a different sex. And yet this is the path to fulfillment that is claimed by transgender activists and the transgender movement. Speaking of therapies that try to bring the individual's gender identity into alignment with the body, that is to say, hey, maybe you're feeling something that's incorrect or you feel wrongly about this. Those kinds of therapies, Dr. Adkins goes on to say that they have been unsuccessful and incredibly harmful. Deep depression, psychosis, and suicide frequently result. Again, coming from Ryan Anderson's book on page 36. So what is the activist treatment plan? That would be, first of all, a social transition for someone who is one biological sex but feels that they are the opposite of that. You should begin wearing the clothes of the opposite gender. You should begin changing your pronouns. You should change your name to match with a more masculine or feminine, depending on which way you're going. You should start behaving as if you are the opposite. Secondly, especially if you are the appropriate age, which is younger, of course, younger, then you would be administered puberty blockers that would prevent your body from going through the natural process of development into puberty. And then you would also be, by age 16, offered what are called cross-sex hormones. So if you're a man, you would begin taking treatments of estrogen. If you were a female, you'd begin taking treatments of testosterone, and you'd be taking that for the purpose of changing your physiology. And by the way, it does. I would encourage you to check out Ryan Anderson's book, When Harry Became Sally, which was published in 2017, but is highly, highly relevant even to this day about how things are being done within the transgender movement and ideology. And then finally, the final step for all of this would be reassignment surgery, where there are actual surgeries, mastectomies, and other surgeries that change the male-female genitalia. And that is the treatment plan. In other words, the only path to fulfillment is to change the body to align with how a person feels, and that is how they are to be fulfilled in their life. That is a claim that is made by the transgender movement. The final claim is this: that society should accept and support this inner sense of self as real and as normal. Anderson again quotes, from a document prepared by the ACLU, the Human Rights Campaign, and Gender Spectrum, the National Center for Lesbian Rights, and the National Education Association. All of those groups came together to present this document as a guide for public schools helping transgender students. Here's how this begins. The expression of transgender identity or any other form of gender expansive behavior is a healthy, appropriate, and typical aspect of human development. So that transgenderism is not to be questioned. If someone steps forward and they are clearly a biological male and they claim to be a female, it is not to be questioned at all. Society should accept and support this inner sense of self as real and as normal. And they push that. That's the idea that's being put out there. A transgender student goes on in Anderson's book, page 40, it said, a transgender student should never be forced to use alternative facilities to make other students comfortable. So we are simply to accept as real a man who says that he is a woman, that he is in fact a woman. And for a woman who claims to be a man, that she is in fact a man. That is the claim of the transgender movement. Now, these are some pretty incredible claims based on some terminology and flying immediately in the face of the Bible's clear teaching about sex and gender and roles. And so what should the Christian's response be to these things? What should the biblical response to the claims of the transgender movement be? We will look at that and explore that in our next video. Thank you for watching today. If this has been a help, if this has been a blessing, please like and please consider subscribing to the channel, as it is a huge help for us to continue to get more content out to you.